On? Oh, it is on. Okay, thank you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We promised people who are faithful attenders at Ccli that we're going to try to start at 10:15 so we don't have this long period of time. So I'm going to have to interrupt great conversations because we want to allow enough time for our speaker to talk. As you know, this is Mental Health Awareness Month, and we're early on in the process. And I can't think of anything that's more important for us as a church to talk about than mental health. I grew up in an era, and I suspect I'm not alone, when mental health issues were not talked about. Do you remember somebody that wasn't with us for a while had a nervous breakdown? Do you remember that? And they would disappear for periods of time, and then all of a sudden they'd be back, but nobody talked about it. So we're in a better place now than we were then, but we're still not out of the woods yet. There are lots of issues that involve mental health. There we go. Sorry about that. Thank you. And we're just going to have to hope that as a church, as a body of Christ, we can do a better job of handling broken emotions and broken minds than we have in the past. So our speaker today is eminently qualified to lead us. Her name is Ann Hirtis, and she's from Iowa. She says that they do a tulip time kind of thing in Iowa too. I don't know much about that, but I suspect that she's telling us the truth. She's a Central College graduate. She's got degrees in social work from Grand Valley, and she's been involved in a lot of social service work. I won't even put a list together of all the places that she's worked. But more importantly, she's been associated with Ottawa County Community Mental Health for a long time. I think you said 12 plus years, if I'm not mistaken. And currently serves as a program supervisor for family and support services. So I am thrilled she's here. I think she's going to share some really useful and important information, and I'm going to pray her into her presentation. Dear Lord, we know that you are the great healer, and that doesn't involve only physical healing. It involves all types of healing, spiritual healing, emotional healing, and other kinds of needs that people all have. Lord, thank you for people like Ann who spend their lives and careers trying to help people manage the complex nature of emotional, behavioral, and other kinds of disabilities that sometimes or often interfere with their ability to function. Thank you for Ann's time here. We look forward to hearing what she has to say. For Christ's name, amen. You're on, Ann. Okay.
Thanks, Ron. I appreciate that. Ooh, didn't realize how loud I would feel up here. So good morning. My name is Ann Hirtis, and it is a pleasure to be with you today. As Ron mentioned, I come to you from Community Mental Health of Ottawa County, where I've been the program supervisor for family services for 12 and a half years. And we'll talk a little bit more about what family services encompasses. For you, though, my position means that I manage all of the supports and services that we do for Community Mental Health of Ottawa County for children birth up to the age of 21. And it is a pleasure to be with you guys this morning. A little bit to share. We're going to do a brief overview about mental health. What are signs and symptoms of mental health? We're going to talk a little bit as well about what can the church, what can us as individuals do, and we'll certainly talk a little bit as well about what community mental health does as an organization. On the back table behind Ron, there are a variety of brochures, and I am happy to have you take as many of those as you would be helpful. Feel free to take some for yourself or take some for a friend, a neighbor, or a family member as well. And if individuals have questions along the way, please raise your hand. I am more than happy to answer questions as we go. Ron's got a microphone so he can come around and get those questions from you. So please feel free to interject at any point. All right, so the question when we talk about what is mental health and what is mental illness, I think it's really important to kind of understand what are we talking about here. So let's look at this definition. According to the Centers for Disease Control, which thanks to COVID, lots of us are much more familiar with the CDC than we have been in the past, mental health is a state of well-being in which I, as an individual, realize my own abilities, I can cope with normal life stresses, I can work productively and fruitfully, and I'm able to make a contribution to my own community. I love this definition because I think, one, it helps each of us to have some sort of barometer, right, that says, am I functioning this way? Am I feeling like I'm able to cope with natural life stressors? Am I able to work fruitfully and productively? It helps us to kind of have a measure of that. At the same time, the other part I love about this definition is it allows each of us to be who we are as individuals in this room. It doesn't say that how I function, how Ron functions, how Ron's granddaughter functions, it doesn't say that all of those have to be the same. We all get to function within our own skills, our own abilities. It is, though, helpful for us to kind of have a baseline of what are we talking about regards to mental health. Oops, and I went too fast. There we go. So some other components related to mental health. Again, that emotional well-being. What is our life satisfaction? How happy are we? Do we have cheerfulness and peacefulness? And the important thing to remember, because we can all certainly attest to that after what's happened in this last year, is that emotional well-being as part of mental health does not mean that I have to always be satisfied with life. It doesn't mean I always have to be happy or cheerful or peaceful. It's that I have the ability to feel those emotions in the midst of the rest of my emotions that I normally feel. We also want to talk about psychological well-being. Those are things like self-acceptance. Do I accept who I am as a person? My feelings about personal growth, including being open to new experiences. What's my level of optimism, hopefulness? Can I find purpose in my life? Control of our environment. My well-being, psychological well-being also includes a sense of spirituality, self-direction, and positive relationships. Whew, there's a lot in that definition for psychological well-being, which I think is, again, helpful to recognize. It's not I have to fit in one little box, right? There's a whole lot of different components that are included in psychological well-being. And again, there may be some days where I feel like I'm getting A's and I'm a rock star, and there may be other days where I'm hanging out in the C category, and that's just fine. And there's other days, yeah, I'm kind of over here and I'm not doing so well, but I'm going to slowly creep back up, right? Because again, we have seen how much psychological well-being has been impacted by this past year, by our need to be so physically distanced from people, and we know it's absolutely taken a huge toll on all of our psychological well-being. Then there's also our social well-being, which we too have certainly seen how that's been impacted with COVID. That also includes our social acceptance, our beliefs in the potential of people and society, our personal self-worth, our usefulness to society, and our sense of community. And I'll be honest, over this past year, it has made me incredibly sad about how much we have all struggled with these different categories, right? So one of the things I want to make sure that everybody hears today is if your mental health has struggled over the past year, everybody's mental health has struggled over the past year. It doesn't feel good. There is no doubt about that. It doesn't feel good to feel like these components of our mental health have struggled. At the same time, it is incredibly normal. So if you've struggled with any of these, take a breath and feel like you are absolutely normal, because we've all been struggling, unfortunately, with these. So let's talk about a little bit about mental illness, because I think this definition can kind of be skewed and a little bit difficult to take because it's so broad. So it could be the collective diagnosable mental health disorders. So that's all the mental health disorders. In our world, in the mental health profession, we have what's called the DSM-5. It's the Diagnostical Statistical Manual. Oof, all sorts of big words that really says, here's a mental health diagnosis. Do you meet that criteria, yes or no? And it's got all sorts of parameters. Some of them are about what signs and symptoms They might be what behaviors you're seeing in somebody. There might be what somebody internally is reporting. It could also be how long those challenges have been happening, all sorts of things. So that's part of what mental illness is. It's all those diagnoses together. It also is related to our health conditions by alterations in thinking, mood, behavior, or some combination thereof associated with distress and or impaired functioning. Again, lots of big words there, so let's break that down. Some examples of mental illness can be associated with lack of peace, struggling with being satisfied with your life, feelings of hopelessness, which we have certainly seen skyrocket in this past year, people feeling lack of hope, struggling in relationships with other people, having a negative outlook on life, not motivated, negative self-esteem, not sure of one's role in life, etc. So again, it's quite encompassing and involves various different aspects. And again, I will tell you, working in public mental health, I've been in public mental health now for 16 years. I've worked specifically at Ottawa CMH for 12 and a half years. Those of us who've been doing this for a long time have seen these examples skyrocketing over the past year, absolutely skyrocketing. Myself and many of my colleagues are repeatedly saying the same thing. I can't believe the number of people we see coming in the door, calling us, reporting these symptoms. Other mental health agencies throughout this community, and this community has a lot of different mental health agencies, they're all reporting the same thing. Skyrocketing numbers of individuals coming in, struggling with some of these different components of mental health concerns. So I wish I had an easy answer for this one, but I don't. What contributes to mental health? It would be so easy if we could just say, oh, it's this one thing, right? Because then we can fix this one thing. Oh, it's so much more complicated than that. There's no single cause. We do know there's a bunch of different things that can contribute to it together. One is called early adverse life experiences. There's a study that was done many years ago out of California that's called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And it talks a lot about how trauma, stressors in early childhood, particularly birth to 6, but certainly birth to the age of 18, can impact overall health. That's physical health, mental health, substance abuse, divorce rates, social relationships, those other types of things. So that is absolutely an important part of what can contribute to mental illness. The other thing is ongoing chronic medical conditions, right? I'm sure some of you could think about a friend or a family member who's had an ongoing chronic medical condition, and you just see in their faces, right, that lack of hope, that feeling of despair and discouragement that comes along with it. So some individuals, their mental illness is going to spike or increase because of those chronic medical conditions. Then there's also biological factors, and this is a toughie. This is so tough because there are certainly people, right, who you can see their parents, their grandparents, generations of that family have issues or greater issues related to depression, to anxiety, substance use, or other sorts of mental health challenges. And yet at the same time, it's fascinating, I think, because we also see sometimes where a family that may have like 4 or 5 children, there may be one child in that family system that has a severe mental illness, and yet the rest of them do not display those same signs and symptoms. Again, I think this is the challenging part of mental illness because it doesn't fit in a nice, neat little box, and we can say there's one issue that we can easily fix. It's so much more complicated than that. Certainly, the use of alcohol and substances can also contribute to mental illness. So for instance, we know that if somebody has depression and they use alcohol to try to cope, which lots of people may choose to do that, we know that alcohol actually makes depression worse. So there will be more intense feelings of hopelessness and sadness. Certainly, the legalization of marijuana, we have seen an increase of marijuana use, and that is also contributing for some individuals. And then there's also certainly some other hardcore drugs. There's methamphetamines, prescription drug use that's not appropriate, all those other types of things. Another thing is limited social connections, which is why those of us who are working in public mental health and mental health as a whole really believe that we have seen a significant spike this past year in how much mental health is impacting other people and how much mental illness is skyrocketing. Because we have been very clearly instructed over this past year for the health and wellness of everybody in our community to stay physically isolated. And for lots of individuals, that has related to or impacted their social isolation, and that unfortunately has significantly impacted mental health. And then the other thing, again, related to that limited social connections, are those feelings of loneliness or isolation. When you're feeling so alone, right, it's hard to get out of your head sometimes. And how many opportunities does that have to negatively impact you and make you feel even more the impact of your mental illness concerns? So we're going to do a few definitions, and I apologize, that looks a little bit not quite as bright as the other ones. So depression, again, some of these terms are very familiar to many of us. We'll just provide short definitions for a little bit of parameters here. So depression, persistent feelings of sadness and loss of interest in activities. So you may be an individual or may know somebody who in the past loved gardening and walking and all sorts of other things, and now they're having persistent, which means at least more than 50% of the time, feelings of sadness and that loss of interest, there we go, got tongue-tied there, in their activities. Suicidality, the act or intention of killing oneself. And this one is so hard, I think, because the minute somebody says, I'm feeling like I want to hurt myself, right? For some of us who hear that, right? Like my shoulders go up, I feel a little bit more tense, right? Because, the heartbreak that you hear with that one. The thing is that I will say that, again, we have also seen in the mental health world an increase in suicidality, in people either acting on or having desires to hurt themselves or to kill themselves. And I want to clarify that you can have suicidality, but not necessarily have depression. Lots of times people think, those two are wrapped around each other. If you're depressed, you could be suicidal. We've seen people who are suicidal who don't meet the normal example for depression as well. Anxiety, a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about some uncertain outcomes. So certainly, in addition to seeing increases in depression over this last year, the pandemic has gotten a lot of us a lot more anxious, myself included, because there has been so much uncertainty, so much lack of control, so much uncertainty that we're living with in our world. And then substance use disorders as well. So that is individuals using substances excessively to cope with the normal stressors that occur within life. So this is kind of a big picture because sometimes when we think about what are the signs and symptoms of mental health concerns, it can be all over the place. It feels like you could tap so many different people and somebody might say, well, this is what it looks like for me. And somebody else is like, oh, no, I don't have that issue, but I have these issues over here. So it really is all encompassing. So for some people, it's going to be withdrawing, right? Holding back from hanging out with other people. You might have a lack of motivation, lack of energy. Struggling to focus is absolutely a notable sign for mental health concerns. And then we also see individuals struggling with changes to their eating or sleeping patterns. Maybe you're struggling to fall asleep, struggling to stay asleep, struggling to wake up. Eating habits may change. Suddenly maybe eating more. There's been certainly lots of talk about the COVID 15 pounds that lots of people have put on in this past year, right? Lots of us have eaten to cope with the stress that we've been feeling. Unexplained angry outbursts. Maybe you know somebody who previously seems fairly calm-natured, easygoing, and all of a sudden they're having these angry outbursts and you're thinking, what in the world is going on? This could be a sign that they're struggling with some mental illness challenges. Certainly suicidal thoughts. We also see irritability, just, that little bit more edgy person, just a little bit more irritable. Increase of substance use. There have been some interesting statistics on the national news recently about how much substance purchases of alcohol has skyrocketed since the pandemic has happened. So again, we're seeing a lot more of that as well. Individuals with overwhelming sense of guilt or shame. Get back to that feelings of hopelessness. That one comes up a lot because it really is an absolute note about mental health. If you're not feeling full of hope or even this much hope, it is very hard, right, to get out of bed, to do activities, to be engaged in your world. Struggling to maintain those healthy habits. We're seeing individuals, including clients currently, or we call them consumers at CMH, who participate in our services, who have been doing really well, participating in therapy, on the same medication, participating in community living supports activities, those other types of things, making notable gains. And all of a sudden with the pandemic hitting, those gains have been lost because people have struggled to maintain those healthy habits. And then another one that you might see is people overreacting. Could be unexplained angry outbursts, but it could be overreacting to some minor, simple situations. So let's take this really close to home right now, and let's look at some Ottawa County statistics. So our Ottawa County Health Department, I want to give a shout out to them. It does a great job of every 3 years doing a survey called the Behavioral Risk Factor of 2020 survey. If anybody is interested in it, I can certainly get you connected to the Ottawa County website. You can read the entire report. It is very robust. It is quite good. Here's some important things that they did in their survey from 2020. 15.3% of individuals that they surveyed, which was well over 1,000 people, reported poor mental health for 14 days or more. And this was self-reports. 19.8% of those individuals reported mild to severe psychological distress. 4.9% of the adults, this was all adults, reported having some thoughts of suicide. 21.8% reported having depression, again, self-reported depression, and 22.9% reported having anxiety. So I share those statistics, one, because I think it's really helpful to know what's happening in our own community. Two, I also hope that for any of you in this room or anybody who might be watching the live stream, find some comfort in these statistics to be like, oh, wow, there are lots of other people who unfortunately or fortunately are having some of the same struggles that I am. Oh, sorry about that. So let's talk for just a minute about what is trauma, because one of the slides, a few slides back, said what contributes to mental health concerns. Trauma is one of those things, and trauma looks very different to all of us. So according to the American Psychological Association, definitions for trauma include sudden or unexpected events, so that could be the death of a loved one or a spouse, sudden car accident, could be the shocking nature of such an event, the death or threat to life or bodily integrity for yourself, subjective feelings, feelings of intense terror, horror, or helplessness. And the important thing is this, being mindful that what's traumatic for one may not be traumatic for another. So for instance, Ron and I may be seeing the same situation unfold, a horrible car accident may have happened in front of us. I might be like, oh, that was terrible. Ron could end up going home and being absolutely quite emotional for the next several days. It doesn't mean that something's right with me and wrong with Ron. It's that we saw that same incident. Something in us, though, said, wow, that was so scary and so traumatic for us. And it's important to recognize that trauma looks very different for different individuals. The other thing that contributes to how that looks is if somebody else has gone through lots of trauma in the past and now they have a new trauma on top of that, right? It kind of compounds one another and makes the weight of that trauma feel very different for individuals. Sorry, I'm a little trigger happy there. So when we talk about the impact of trauma, it's important to recognize that trauma impacts the whole being. One of the things I love about working in the mental health field, besides the fact that it is the most challenging profession I have ever been in, the most challenging job thus far in my career, is the impact of trauma. Trauma has a huge impact on our physical health. One of the things that's so important, which is why we spend a lot of time asking people when they come in our doors at any mental health agency here in our community, including community mental health, is we're going to ask about trauma during childhood. Because one of the things that we know, science tells us very well, is how much our brain development is impacted by childhood traumas. Because it's scary. Brain tissue can in fact die. There can be a lack of all those connectors that happen in the brain so naturally. As a child, you have brain connectors that are in the millions. But unfortunately, when you have a trauma, those connections are lacking. It can also, for children, result in attention and learning challenges, which, right, can certainly impact us as adults. There's emotional regulation difficulties. How do I process being angry, being sad, being frustrated, being annoyed, being happy? And then challenges with behavioral control. So talking in the kid world for a moment here, one of the things that we repeatedly see is, talking in the kid world for a moment here, one of the things that we repeatedly see is when children come to us with these explosive behaviors, some parents may say, I don't know what is going on with my kid. They're kind of a pain in my butt. And we will often say, let's dig deeper, because we recognize that for children, certainly can happen for adults. In my world, in the kid world, we focus a lot on those behaviors, because sometimes those behaviors are, I don't know what I'm doing and I don't know how to control myself, so I'm going to lash out in a behavioral way. So we really take a look at that. But that is certainly one of the impacts